Welcome back to Silent Husband Club. We've missed you, and we're sorry for the long silence. We're working to bring fresh stories more often again, aiming for a new episode nearly every day. Settle in. This one cuts deep. I threw a clean punch at my oldest friend, and he smiled through the blood like he'd been waiting for it. That's when I understood, the kiss wasn't the crime, it was the opening move. And the real war? It had my father's name stamped all over it. If this hook grabbed you, please subscribe, like, and drop a comment. It helps the channel grow, and it lets you know the moment a new story goes live. They say evening air in the Blue Ridge carries the truth better than daylight. Maybe that's just something men like me tell ourselves when we're afraid to listen in the sun. Either way, that night the air had a cool bite, clean and quiet, with a hint of wood smoke floating over our backyard in Pinebridge. I stood on my porch with a bottle sweating in my hand, watching the light from our kitchen spill gold across the grass. Inside, friends laughed. Glasses clinked. A record we forgot to change crooned with that soft, bluesy scratch that makes a home feel older than it is. I'm Caleb Mercer. I fix what other people give up on. Engines. Doors that sag on their hinges. Mowers that cough to death every spring. Ask around Blackwood and someone will point you to my garage. They'll tell you I'm patient. Steady. Stubborn when it counts. I believed in torque specs and honest work and the kind of silence between two people that means comfort, not distance. For 12 years, I believe my marriage was exactly that kind of silence, comfortable. You don't measure a life like that in big moments. You measure it in breakfasts that taste the same and porch swings that squeak on the same note. Eve Evelyn Shaw stood by the kitchen island in a pale sweater, hair tucked behind one ear, head tilted the way it always tilts when she's listening more than she's talking. She held a glass of wine and gave a small smile at something someone said. There was kindness in it, but not warmth, or maybe the warmth just wasn't for me. Next to her, too close for a house that still had my boots by the door, stood Red Callahan. I'd known Red since we were boys roughhousing behind the church, since busted knuckles and late-night scrapes, since handshakes that meant I got you when no one else did. There's a way some men stand when they want something. Loose shoulders. Easy grin. Eyes that never stop taking measurements. Red had that posture that night, that hunter's ease softened up to pass for charm. I told myself it was the beer. Told myself it was years and memory playing tricks. I told myself a lot of things while I kept watching from the porch, pretending to watch the yard. I stepped off the last plank and onto the cool grass, walked the side path like I needed air, like the house was hot, like the noise just got too thick. Truth is, I wanted a different angle. The front yard was darker. The big maple cast shadows across the lane, and music drifted out the open windows. Not loud. That's not our style. Just enough to coat the night. When I stopped at the corner of the house, I heard voices low, careful, a murmur you hear through a wall when you strain to hear it. I leaned just far enough to see them, even right near the edge of our driveway, right by the old oak roots that pushed the pavement up like knuckles. She crossed her arms, not defensive, just holding herself tight. He stepped in, too close. That practiced tilt of the head. That voice I'd heard talk tired people into one more round. Then he moved for the kiss. No ceremony. No warning. Like he was reaching for a door he already owned. I didn't think. That's not how it looked from the outside, but honest truth, my body had made up its mind before my brain caught up. I covered the distance fast. The bottle fell somewhere behind me, a dull thud in the grass. I grabbed Red by the shoulder and wrenched him back, and when he turned, mouth open, half a lie already on his tongue, I let a single punch go, precise, not wild. I've thrown worse into rusted bolts. I've thrown softer into stubborn pulleys. He stumbled, palm to his mouth, eyes watering. Someone opened our front door behind me. I felt the draft of light. Heard a small gasp. Eve said my name, Caleb, not a plea, not a scold. A statement. Rhett's hand came away from his lips glossy with blood, and I'll tell you the piece that bit, he wasn't angry. He was satisfied. Like a fisherman who felt the line tighten and knew the hook finally set. That look chilled me harder than the air. I turned to Eve. She wasn't crying. She looked at Rhett, then at me, and there was a hard truth in her eyes. Whatever happened a moment ago did not start a moment ago. I didn't know it then, but that was the last second in my life when I still believed in the old version of my father, my wife, and my friend, all at the same time. Morning came with silence that didn't feel like rest. The owls clicked inside the way old wood does when the night's cold gives way, but it sounded like a stranger breathing. My coffee went cold while I stared through it. Upstairs, I heard Eve moving softly, like a person trying not to wake a bear. Neither of us had slept. We shared a mattress and divided it like a border. No one crossed. The doorbell rang at 8:18 a.m. I knew who it was before I got there. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Red on the porch, mouth swollen, bruise cresting under his eye like a storm at sea. He stood the way men stand when they've decided they won't flinch. I opened the door without a word. I came to talk, he said, both hands up like we were at the end of a standoff. Talk, I said, meaning, choose your words like you intend to live with them. Not here, he answered. Walk. I grabbed my coat off the hook. We moved down the street with that quiet you only get on a weekend morning in a small town. Someone's mower coughed to life in the distance. A flag clinked against a pole. We reached the edge of the park and stopped under bare trees that sketched lines across the bright sky. I shouldn't have done what I did, Rhett said. That wasn't how it was supposed to happen. Those are the kinds of sentences that make a man go cold from the inside out. What, exactly, I asked, was supposed to happen? You weren't supposed to see it. We stood with that version of the truth between us, the I meant to betray you, but I didn't mean to get caught version. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with planning. She's your wife, he said. I crossed a line. I won't dance around that. You had the right to hit me. He let that sit there like an olive branch he didn't expect me to take. But you think last night is the story. It isn't. It's the tip of a blade you've been carrying in your life for a long time, and you never felt it cut. You always loved your speeches, I said, keeping my voice low. Men hear low voices faster than shouts. Say what you came to say. There are things about your marriage, he said, and your past, that you don't see. Not because you're blind, Caleb. Because you trust too hard. And you trust the wrong people. Eve? I asked. Her name felt heavier than my coat. I'm not saying more than I should, he said, eyes steady and sharp bright. Not yet. If I tell you everything right now, you won't believe me. Start digging. Ask the questions you've never asked, not about last night. About before. Try me, I said, stepping in until his breath fog clung to mine. Not like this, he answered, glancing at my fists, which I hadn't realized I was still clenching. You want the truth? Stop assuming you already own it. He took 3 steps away, then turned. You hit hard. Always did. Ask yourself what happens when the person standing beside you for 12 years learns to hit soft. Soft hurts longer. He left me there with the wind in the park and the math of my life suddenly not adding up. I stayed until I couldn't feel my fingers, and even then I waited for the anger to arrive like a warm coat I didn't deserve. It didn't come. Something colder did, a question I didn't want. What if he wasn't lying? Back home I fixed a hinge that didn't need fixing. I turned the faucet on and off twice to hear the water change pitch. I told myself to get to the shop, keep my hands busy, let the noise of compressors and ratchets unclench the mind. But the mind is a stubborn engine. When it's flooded, it won't catch. I kept thinking of Eve's face on the porch, not guilty, not defiant. Just resolved. The kind of look a person wears after they've already had the conversation in their head 100 times and decided you're never going to hear it the way they mean it. By evening, the house dipped into that hour when light goes thin and rooms look like photographs. Eve sat on the couch with a blanket over her legs, phone in her hand, thumb moving, eyes far away. I sat opposite and listened to the hum of our refrigerator like it could tell me pieces of the truth in Morse code. "Feeling any better?" she asked finally, voice clean, tearful. "Not really," I said. No blame in it. Just the kind of honesty that tastes metallic. We didn't fight. Fighting would have meant heat. We didn't have that, not anymore. We had a gap with furniture on both sides. And out past the sofa, near her work bag, I caught a slip of paper where a zipper stood open. Nothing, probably. A grocery list. A receipt. But once suspicion climbs into a man's lap, it settles its weight and refuses to be shooed. Later, upstairs water ran in steam side under the bathroom door. I stood in the kitchen, looking at her tablet on the counter. 4 digits locked it. I tried her birth year. No. The day we married. No. My own year, 1984, and the screen opened like it had been waiting for me, like a dog at the door wagging for a master who never comes home late. I didn't go rifling through the obvious. I know how to look without scratching paint. The browser. The notes. The recent apps. A cooking app Eve never used sat there too neat, like a wrench on the wrong pegboard hook. Inside it, instead of recipes, there were entries with food names, each hiding a page of words that didn't belong together: banana bread, roast chicken, dill salmon, none of them about dinner. They were about Thursdays that felt like walls and mornings that went quiet, and a loneliness that learned a person's first name. Mine didn't appear much. Another name did. Rats. I read just enough to know the shape of what I didn't want to know. It wasn't an affair in the way people mean when they slam doors. It was closer and colder, attention traded like currency, secrets stacked like washers, small and thin until the pile has weight. The worst lines weren't about feeling. They were about strategy. Openings. Leverage. That word stuck like a splinter. I put the tablet down the way you put down a hot part you almost burned yourself on, carefully, pretending it never touched your hand. Then I went out to the garage and stood in the quiet where I can usually hear my father's voice telling me which bolt will crack if I force it. I tried to pray, and the only prayer I found was a question: when did we stop speaking and start performing? I didn't have an answer. I had a night that stretched long and thin, and a seed planted by a man with blood on his lip who smiled when I hit him. By the time the sun edged up and made a bright blade across the workbench, I understood one thing: I could swing hard all day and still miss what mattered. It was time to look under the chassis I'd been afraid to put on the lift. That was the night I stopped believing silence meant peace. It can. Sometimes. But sometimes silence is just the sound you get when the engine isn't firing at all. The next morning carried the weight of a hangover I hadn't earned, a silence that pressed down on the house until even the refrigerator's hum felt intrusive. I sat at the table with cold coffee and empty hands, while upstairs Eve moved carefully, footsteps light, as if I were a sleeping animal she didn't dare wake. The yard outside still showed scars from the night before: trampled flowers, blood speckled near the drive, and that empty bottle lying in the grass like evidence I never meant to leave behind. My body was heavy, my mind wired, and every second ticked by with the steady mockery of the wall clock. The doorbell rang at 8:18 sharp. I knew it would be him before I checked. Rhett stood there, lips split, one eye dark with a bruise, but posture calm like a man who had nothing left to hide. He asked for a walk, and against my own instincts, I went. We walked through Pine Bridge's quiet streets until we reached the edge of the park, where bare trees clawed at the cold sky. There, Rhett dropped words that cracked the ground under my feet. He admitted the kiss, admitted crossing the line, but said it was never about Eve alone. You weren't supposed to see it, he told me, and those 6 words cut deeper than the punch I had thrown. He claimed there was more, something buried in my marriage, something buried in my past, and that I'd been blind to it because I trusted the wrong people. He refused to spell it out, told me instead to start digging. That phrase lodged in me like a nail I couldn't pull free. Start digging. It gnawed at me all day, followed me into the garage where my tools lay untouched, where the hum of silence sounded like judgment. By nightfall, I gave in to the weight pressing me down. Eve sat on the couch, blanket pulled over her knees, scrolling on her phone without seeing a thing. Her face was calm, but her eyes drifted like someone already elsewhere. I tried to ask, tried to bridge the space, but my words landed flat and heavy. She replied in soft tones, careful, almost too careful. When she went upstairs to shower, I was left alone with the tablet charging on the counter. I told myself I wasn't a man who snooped. But men like me, we take apart engines when they cough wrong. We don't wait for smoke to tell us there's a fire. The tablet unlocked easier than it should have, my own birth here, as if she knew I'd never try. Inside, the notes weren't notes at all. A cooking app, dressed in innocent icons, open like a vault. Banana bread. Roast chicken. Dill salmon. Recipes masking confessionals. I scrolled, reading lines I wasn't meant to read, Thursdays when she felt invisible. The ache of being unseen. Loneliness finding a voice. And Rhett's name scattered in the margins like grease on clean steel. It wasn't an affair. Not yet. But it was a space she carved between us, and Rhett had filled it with the kind of attention I never thought she needed. The worst part wasn't the pain of betrayal, it was the realization she hadn't hidden it because she never thought I'd look. Each entry felt deliberate, organized, like a diary coded in plain sight. Loneliness, attention, leverage. That last word made me grip the counter hard enough to leave sweat stains. It wasn't just emotion, it was a game. And I was the only one not playing. I left the tablet where it was and walked out into the garage, the one place in my life that always gave me straight answers. But even there, the walls felt different, thinner, like the silence wasn't mine anymore. I stared at engines that had always obeyed me, bolts that always came loose with patience and pressure, and I realized I was standing in the middle of my life without a single tool sharp enough for the job ahead. Rhett had told me to start digging. And as much as I hated him in that moment, the truth is, he'd already handed me the first shovel. That night, I didn't dream. I lay awake beside Eve, staring at the ceiling, while the tick of the clock measured out the distance between us inch by inch. By morning, I knew I couldn't stop at suspicion. I needed confirmation. And the first place to look would be the last place she'd expect, outside the house, in the eyes of someone who'd been watching from the shadows of the street all along. By late morning, the neighborhood moved on as if nothing had cracked open the night before. Kids raced their bikes past mailboxes, leaf blowers hummed against fences, and dogs barked at nothing, but for me the whole world sounded out of tune. I stood on my porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring across the street like a man waiting for a signal he didn't understand. That's when my eyes landed on Marta Keene, my neighbor, the sharp-eyed widow with the neatest garden in Blackwood. She had a way of noticing things others overlooked, and I realized if anyone knew the truth about Eve and Rhett, it would be her. I didn't want to walk across that street. but the weight in my chest pushed me forward until my boots crunched her gravel path. Marta looked up from trimming her roses, studied my face with those hawk eyes, and met me halfway at the gate. I asked her straight if she'd seen Eve and Rhett together when I wasn't around. She didn't answer right away, but the silence was thick enough. Finally, she admitted she had seen them 4, maybe 5 times. Always during the day, sometimes when Rhett parked a little further down the road like a man trying not to be seen. Her words weren't dramatic, but they landed heavy. Once or twice they'd left together, never long, half an hour at most. Another time she saw him touch her arm by the mailbox, too familiar, too deliberate. Eve didn't pull away. She didn't lean in either. She just froze. And somehow, that stillness cut deeper than if she had moved. Marta's voice softened, and she told me what I already feared. You're a good man, Caleb. People around here see that. But you deserve to know what's in your own house. Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's just noise we've learned to ignore. I stood there, nodding, my throat too tight for thanks. Her words stayed with me long after I turned back toward my porch. I stepped inside, and the sound of our washing machine greeted me from the laundry room, so soft, so domestic, so normal. But normal had been a disguise for too long, and I knew it. The house wasn't quiet anymore, it was loaded. For the next 2 days, I avoided Rhett's texts, 2 short messages that read like bait, we should talk when you've cooled off, and, you deserve to know the whole story. I deleted them both. But by the 3rd day, I found myself walking into the Copper Kettle Diner, the oldest place in town, a corner booth that smelled like coffee and fried eggs. Rhett was already there, looking calm, too calm, with a bruise fading under his eye and a mug in his hand. I slid across from him without a word. He looked at me like he was grateful I came. Then he leaned in and began to talk, not about Eve at first, but about my father. He spoke about Copper Ridge, the land my father built his name on, the deal that started our family business. Rhett told me it hadn't been clean, that his uncle once owned that land, that my father had handled paperwork while his uncle was recovering from surgery. When the family finally checked, the deed was gone. Transferred. Filed. Legal, but crooked. For years they tried to challenge it, but they lost everything. Rhett's eyes burned as he slid a paper across the table, a deed with my father's signature bold across the page. The other line, meant for Rhett's uncle, was blank. My pulse throbbed in my ears as I stared down at it. I wanted to believe it was a lie, another manipulation, but something in Rhett's voice told me it wasn't. He wasn't angry when he said it. He was tired. Worn out by years of carrying the weight. Your father built his name by stepping over mine, he said, and for the first time I saw his betrayal as more than lust or opportunity. It was revenge sharpened by years of bitterness. And Eve? That part stung the worst. He told me it started because she felt invisible, because she reached out to him one day and he didn't push her away. He admitted he didn't plan it, but he didn't stop it either. He said the words like a confession, calm, steady, almost clinical. I sat there, staring at him, not sure what burned more, the thought of Eve's loneliness spilling into Rhett's hands, or the realization that my father, the man I had built my whole life around, might not have been the man I thought he was. Rhett finished with a line that clung to me like oil on skin, you didn't break me, Caleb. But you opened a door, and now you'll have to see what's behind it. I left the diner with more than I came in with: anger, confusion, and the cold truth that the ground I stood on might never have been mine to begin with. That night I climbed into the attic of my father's old house, a place that smelled of dust and dry wood, where every box felt like a sealed confession. I hadn't been up there in years. The light was thin, slanting through a round window, catching the air so it looked like drifting snow. My boots creaked on the boards as I knelt before an old chest I remembered from childhood. The lock still had its key taped beneath it, the way my father always trusted habit over technology. With a snap it opened, and inside I found ledgers, folders, and envelopes stacked like bones of a past no one wanted disturbed. I pulled out one marked Copper Ridge Investment, 1996. The pages held numbers, payments, and names. One name repeated, E. Callahan. My hand shook as I turned faster, until I found a letter on faded letterhead and escrow notice that confirmed the transfer of land. Even the one signature line was blank. The counterparty had never signed. Still, it had been filed. I sat back, my breath shallow, staring at proof I never wanted to see. My father had built our garage, our life, on ground stolen through loopholes and timing. It wasn't outright theft, but it was manipulation, a kind that cut deeper because it wore the mask of legality. I closed my eyes, but the images kept burning. The boy in that old photograph, standing proud beside a man he thought was unshakable, now realizing that smile had been nailed to a stolen beam. Rhett hadn't lied. He'd been carrying a truth I hadn't had the courage to face. When I finally sat across from Eve, I carried not just Rhett's words but the weight of those documents. She looked at me calmly, as if she had been expecting this conversation for weeks. I told her I had read the notes on her tablet. For the first time, she didn't deflect. She nodded, almost in relief, and said, "You want the truth? Fine." Her voice didn't break. She spoke like someone who had rehearsed 100 times and finally let the words out raw. She admitted she had felt invisible, year after year, as I buried myself in tools and schedules. She admitted Rhett noticed, asked her questions I hadn't asked in years, and that she answered. She told me she didn't plan for it, but she leaned into it because the silence between us had grown too wide. When I asked if she cheated, she shook her head. Not in the way I thought. They hadn't slept together. There had been one moment, she admitted, but she froze, and that was when I walked outside. Her words didn't come with tears or anger. They came with grief, steady and unflinching. And they made me realize something I hadn't wanted to admit. She had reached out, once, in small ways I had brushed aside. A trip she suggested. A night she wanted away from the shop. And I had answered with not now. I closed my eyes and saw those moments differently, the missed signals that turned into distance, the distance that turned into silence, the silence that became an opening Rhett slid into. I didn't shout. I didn't break anything. I just sat there, feeling like my life was a machine I'd been proud of, only to realize the foundation bolt had been stripped years ago. When I finally spoke, I said, "I don't know what happens next." Eve answered the same. Neither of us had an ending ready. We only had a truth stretched raw between us, impossible to repair in that moment. But one thing grew sharp in my chest: Rhett had been playing more than one game. He had confessed just enough to poison me against my wife, while keeping back the leverage he believed would break me entirely. And if I knew anything about machines, it was this: you can't fix what you don't see. So I made a decision. I would no longer wait for answers. I would take control of the silence and dismantle it, piece by piece, until the truth was bare. That night, under the dim bulb of my garage, I began to prepare, not with rage, but with order. 3 envelopes. 3 names. Rhett. Eve. Hollis and Reed, the law firm. No threats. No shouting. Just proof. My father's deeds. Eve's hidden words. Rhett's manipulations. I would send them all the truth, cold and unvarnished. And for Rhett, I added one final note in my own hand: you didn't break me. I dismantle. I sealed the envelopes carefully, the way a mechanic tightens a final bolt before turning the key. And when I placed them in my truck, I knew the engine of my life was about to roar, not with fury, but with reckoning. The envelopes went out in the morning, carried by a courier who didn't ask questions. By mid-afternoon, I knew they had landed. Red opened his in the kitchen of his house. Inside were 3 pages that stripped him bare. The first was a copy of the deed transfer from Copper Ridge in 1996, highlighted, annotated, showing my father's bold signature against a blank line where his uncle should have been. The second was a series of fragments from his messages with Eve, not romantic confessions but tactical ones, lines about leverage, about waiting for me to falter, about using my trust as a weapon. The third was a note in my own handwriting. You had your chance to speak to me like a man. Instead, you whispered in corners. I don't break. I dismantle. No signature, no threats, just truth, sharp as a blade. Eve received her own package, smaller. A simple flash drive with a folder titled What You Didn't Say Out Loud. When she plugged it in, she saw every note, every message, every hidden confession she thought had vanished. It wasn't just guilt that settled in her chest, it was the weight of realizing she had built a second life in shadows, and now those shadows were on display, organized in clean lines by a man she thought would never look. She left me a voicemail later, her voice steady, almost resigned. She said she had read it all, that she didn't know how she became someone who let another man feed her loneliness, that she wouldn't stay because I shouldn't have to ask her to leave. She ended with silence, the kind that sounded more honest than any apology. Hollis and Reed, the law firm, got their envelope last. Inside were ledgers and notarized documents, a request to reopen the Copper Ridge file, and my signed statement waiving claim. No lawsuits. No dramatics. Just a stone dropped in water, rippling outward. By the end of that week, it became public. My father had taken advantage of the Callahan family, and though the deal had been legal, it reeked of betrayal. I returned the land, relinquished the name, and handed over every record that proved our garage had been built on someone else's ruin. The town read about it in a short column in the paper, quiet, factual, no headlines. Some looked at me differently, some whispered. But I stood tall, because I had nothing left to hide. Noah Pike, the young mechanic who once kept his head down in my shop, came by one evening. I handed him the keys and told him the garage was his now. He blinked, stammered, asked what about me. I told him the truth. I had built something solid on stolen ground, and it was time someone else built it better. He didn't know what to say, but I could see the weight in his eyes. For him it was opportunity. For me it was release. Rhett, for all his scheming, didn't escape untouched. Word spread faster than he thought it would. Business deals pulled back, contracts slipped through his hands. People in Blackwood stopped looking at him with trust and started looking at him with suspicion. He had wanted to turn my silence into leverage, but when the truth came out, he was the one left exposed. He wasn't ruined, but he was smaller, stripped of the power he thought he held over me. As for Eve, she left quietly, taking little more than what she had brought into the marriage. No fight. No screaming. Just absence where her presence had been, a kind of stillness that told me this was no longer her home. I didn't chase her. I didn't beg. I let the silence stand. Because by then I had learned something valuable. Peace doesn't come from holding tighter. It comes from letting go. On a gray Sunday morning, I packed a duffel and loaded it into my truck. I stood on the porch of that empty house one last time, watching the street I'd once called mine. The wind pushed through the trees, leaves skittering across the road, the same road I had walked so many times without knowing what was being kept from me. Then I stepped off the porch and didn't look back. The road stretched west like a ribbon, unwinding into the Blue Ridge where no one knew my name. I wasn't running. I wasn't hiding. I was leaving behind the noise of lies and carrying nothing but the truth, stripped bare and heavy, but mine. The road carried me further west until I found a cabin on the edge of a still lake, a place too quiet to ask questions and too far from Blackwood to hear its whispers. The sign out front said simply cabins for rent. No Wi-Fi. No refunds. That was enough for me. The cabin was small, a single room with a fireplace, a bed, and a table worn smooth by years of hands I'd never know. The window looked out on water so calm it mirrored the sky, a glass surface that made me feel like I was staring into something larger than myself. Each morning I rose with the sun, brewed coffee on a stove that hissed and rattled, and sat on the porch listening to the birds argue with the silence. No plans. No deadlines. Just breath and weather. One morning, as a storm rolled in across the hills, I sat with a leather-bound notebook I hadn't touched in years. I wrote slowly, not about Red or Eve, not about the garage or the land or even my father. I wrote about weight, the kind a man carries when he doesn't want to burden others, the kind that comes from mistakes that aren't his but feel like they belong to his spine anyway. Somewhere in the middle of the page, I wrote one line and circled it: you don't find peace by winning. You find peace by letting go. When the storm broke, the lake rippled, the wind rattled the windows, and I stood in the doorway watching the sky pour itself out. And something inside me poured out with it. I hadn't come here to heal. I didn't even believe in that word. Healing suggests going back, and I had no intention of going back to the man who missed the signs in his own house, or to the son who idolized a father without knowing his shadow. What I found instead was clarity. Not forgiveness, not forgetfulness, just clarity. That night I lit a fire, not for warmth, but for presence. The flames moved with a life of their own, and I sat beside them with the notebook open, words still wet on the page. Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the silence no longer felt dangerous. It felt earned. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a photograph, me as a boy, standing beside my father under the freshly nailed garage sign. Both of us smiling, proud, blind to the cracks beneath our feet. I looked at it one last time, then let the wind take it. The photo lifted, spun once in the air, and disappeared into the night beyond the lake. For the first time in months, my shoulders loosened. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even lost. I was stripped down to something real, bare as a field after harvest, ready for whatever comes next. I had given Rhett the truth, given Eve her freedom, returned what my father had taken, and left the ruins standing instead of trying to cover them. They would always be there, a part of me, but they no longer defined me. When I turned from the fire and closed the cabin door, I knew this wasn't exile. It wasn't escape. It was something quieter, steadier. It was peace. And peace, I'd learned, doesn't come when the world gives it to you. It comes when you finally decide to walk into it yourself. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, shocked you, or simply made you think, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment, your thoughts, your story, your truth. Subscribe for more raw, real, and unforgettable confessions. And if this story made you feel seen, share it. Someone else might need to hear it too. You're not alone here. This channel is a safe space for those who've been betrayed, broken, and rebuilt.